Industry and the Committee on Legislative Franchises, including, of course, their respective
Parang
chairperson.
antay lang sabi niya sa
Philippine Competition Commission focuses on the impact on competition and consumer welfare of the transaction. So it is really with regard to the acquisition of shares by ABS-CBN in TV5 that the mandate of the Competition Commission is focused on. Now, we submitted a position paper earlier, I believe yesterday, to the Honorable Chair and the Secretariats, and I hope that that will be circulated as well to all the members of the committees herein present. We also have had no ample opportunity to look at the details of the transaction, primarily because up till now, ABS-CBN and TV5 have not notified the Commission of their transaction. Under the law and under our rules, they do have 30 days within which to notify us if the transaction happens to be a notifiable transaction, meaning that it meets the thresholds provided for in the law, the IRR, and other relevant legislation. So we have two issues before us as far as the Commission is concerned. First is whether the transaction is notifiable under the law and under our rules. And secondly, regardless of whether it is notifiable, and I will explain the reasons for this broad concept later, regardless of whether it is notifiable, whether the transaction is likely to result in a substantial lessening of competition that we can review and thereafter prohibit or subject to conditions. So if you will allow me, Mr. Chair, I'd like to discuss the first issue, which is the notifiability of the transaction. Unlike the SEC, we do not have a copy of the investment agreement and the other related documents. What we have are publicly available information, which have already been articulated before the committees. Based on these publicly available information, it appears to be that the transaction is not notifiable. It does not meet the transaction value under the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act, or Bayanihan 2. If you will recall, under this law, Congress required the PCC for a period of 2 years, or until September 15 or thereabouts, 2022, to review only mergers or acquisitions with a transaction value of more than 50 billion pesos. This means that either of the parties must have assets or revenues in the preceding year of more than 50 billion. This is what we refer to as the size of party test. And secondly, that generally, because this transaction is a transaction within the Philippines, that the entity to be acquired must have assets or revenues in excess as well of 50 billion pesos. This is known as the size of transaction test. Now, additionally, the requirement under the PCA where the transaction involves an acquisition of shares remains applicable. That is that the transaction must result in more than 35% of the voting shares being transferred to the acquiring entity. So, with regard to the present transaction, insofar as the size of party test, the aggregate value of the Lopez Group assets in the Philippines amounts to approximately 456 billion pesos, which is in excess of the 50 billion threshold under the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act. Meanwhile, PLDT's aggregate value of assets in the Philippines amounts to 525 billion pesos, more or less, and therefore the size of party test is met. With regard to the second test, the size of transaction, TV5's value of assets in the Philippines only amounts to 7 billion pesos, which is below the 50 billion peso threshold. And as the SEC mentioned earlier, their revenues in the past 3 years have been in the red, meaning that their revenues have been in the form of losses, and these range from 2.5 billion pesos to 1.2 billion pesos in the last 3 years. Now, in the same vein, the transaction also relates only to acquisition of shares that would result in ownership of 34.99% of voting shares, and therefore not meeting the requirement of the acquisition of at least 35% of the voting shares in order to qualify under this size of transaction test. And therefore, under this second test, it appears that the transaction is not notifiable. Now, even if it is not notifiable, because it does not meet the thresholds provided under the law and under our IRR and under Bayanihan to Recover as One Act, it does not preclude the parties from voluntarily notifying the PCC under Section 3.2 of the PCC Rules on Merger Procedure within 30 days from the execution of their investment agreement. The Commission, in its discretion, may give due force to such voluntary notifications subject to the review period of a total of 135 days. 45 days for phase one, and if there is an indication of a substantial restriction on competition, which necessitates a deeper analysis, we can have another 90 days for a phase two review. Now, suppose the parties do not voluntarily notify the Commission. Can the PCC conduct a review of the transaction on its own initiative or motu proprio? The answer is yes. Section 16 of the Philippine Competition Act gives the Commission broad powers to review mergers and acquisitions based on factors it deems relevant. Section 13 of our Rules on Merger Procedures further provides the trigger when this motu proprio review may be exercised. That is when the PCC has reasonable grounds to believe that the transaction is likely to substantially prevent, restrict, or lessen competition in the market. As an update on this and in the exercise of our authority, the Commission and Bank has directed its Mergers and Acquisitions Office, the unit under the PCC, which conducts merger review, to make an initial assessment of whether the transaction is likely to substantially prevent, restrict, or lessen competition, and as such, whether the Commission has reasonable grounds to initiate a motu proprio review. Note that these reasonable grounds is the legal standard by which we can initiate a motu proprio review, and therefore it is important that we get a report and a recommendation that the Commission and Bank can act upon based on the initial assessment of our Mergers and Acquisitions Office. Now, suppose either the parties voluntarily notify or the Commission undertakes a motu proprio review of the transaction, what will we be looking at? Well, as Congressman Marcoleta mentioned earlier, we will be looking at whether the transaction has the object or effect, or in more common terms, layman terms, is likely to substantially lessen competition. Now, we look at, from a competition perspective, two dimensions. These two dimensions are, first, are the parties competitors? Are they operating in the same segment of the value chain? And if they are, what these markets are, what these lines of businesses in which the acquiring and acquired entities compete, and whether the resulting concentration of market shares in these markets will cause a substantial lessening of competition. So we have had an initial look at the lines of businesses that may indicate a potential competition or overlap between ABS-CBN and TV5. And we noted that whereas TV5, prior to the investment agreement and prior to the operationalization of that investment agreement, is also involved in content production and content distribution and programming. This overlaps with ABS-CBN and its subsidiaries'
Ano ba to?
main business now of content production, development, distribution, and programming. This may involve entertainment shows, talk shows, documentaries, news, and films. Now, there is a parallel transaction involving Signal's acquisition of Sky Cable. And we all know that the parent companies of these two companies are also the companies involved in the transaction under review by the committee today.
60
Now, moving on, the second dimension that we examine from a competition perspective is, apart from the segments in the value chain where these entities may be competing, we also look at whether or not they are actually suppliers and consumers for certain products. Meaning, do they have a vertical relationship such that the inputs of one entity are derived from the output of the other entity? So, in this kind of relationship, we look at the vertical effects of that kind of input and output relationship. If ABS-CBN is a content developer,
Ano pa hearing na to?
will its output in
Hearing
terms
na ano
of
to?
content and shows and
Channel
all
to?
that
Ha?
now
Hearing
be
na nga channel
limited
to?
to TV5
Sa
under the
TV5
investment
saka
agreement?
ABS-CBN.
Will it now no longer be available in the other media platforms through
Nag-hearing
which
pa
they
sila
were
eh.
previously viewed,
Gumagana na
whether
yung ano.
these are in traditional media or in social media
Ooperate na.
platforms? And therefore, if this is going to happen, will there be less choice for consumers to view these programs? And part of the competition considerations
Dapat
is
pag
to ensure that
nag-hearing,
consumer welfare is not prejudiced
hindi
by
gumagana
any
yung ano,
transaction that
gumagana
comes before the review of the commission.
Ooperate na eh.
Now, is it also possible that this content, by being provided to TV5, will now allow TV5 to compete more effectively against incumbents in the TV and radio broadcasting space? When ABS-CBN was closed in 2020, its other competitor in the market for TV and radio broadcasting, GMA7, assumed dominance of
Wala siyang sample?
the broadcasting services industry. Why do we say this? Well, when ABS-CBN and GMA7 were both operating, they had between 35 to 40% of the market share each for TV and radio broadcasting, or at the very least for TV broadcasting. When ABS-CBN was shut down, there was a diversion of those who patronized and used ABS-CBN. There was a diversion in favor of GMA7, such that the market share of GMA7, depending on the entities which were reviewing market share analysis for this sector, ranged from 53.6% to 65%. So, using the presumptive evidence that we can accord to such percentages, as far as we are concerned, GMA7 became the dominant incumbent insofar as TV and radio broadcasting services are concerned. Now, with ABS-CBN buying into TV5 and providing the content that TV5 apparently needs, would TV5 now be able to impose a competitive pressure on GMA7's dominance such that it effectively fosters competition in the market? These are considerations that we have to look into. And the parallel transaction involving the acquisition of shares by Signal and Sky Cable, apart from having its own impact on competition within the market for cable TV or satellite TV, in and of itself adds further complications to the examination of the impact on competition of ABS-CBN's investment in TV5. Now, as I said earlier, these are questions which we will have to address in the context of a review, whether triggered by a voluntary notification by the parties or by the Commission motu proprio exercising its initiative or power to conduct reviews of mergers which may have an impact on competition. We cannot answer these questions and issues now. To do so would be premature. We would have to do economic analysis, market analysis, and examine the legal, commercial, and economic context in which these parties operate, in able to be in a position to make findings and conclude on whether or not the transaction will substantially lessen competition in the market. Now, a question is raised by some on whether the first issue on non-notification to the PCC of the acquisition is a ground for the transaction's prohibition and cancellation. I can only point to Section 17 of the Philippine Competition Act, where it says that agreements consummated in violation of the requirement to notify, where they are so required, will result in the agreement being considered void and the parties subject to an administrative fine of between 1% to 5% of the value of the transaction. However, as I mentioned earlier, at least based on a preliminary evaluation by our Mergers and Acquisitions Office, the transaction does not seem to be notifiable. Now, at the end point, if we conduct a review, and it so happens that we find that the transaction substantially lessens competition in the market, what can the PCC do? First, under the law, we can prohibit the transaction. Alternatively, we can also subject the transaction to conditions to remedy the effect on competition in the market, the negative effect on competition in the market. And in this case, parties can also come forward and voluntarily offer commitments, as we call them, to remedy that anti-competitive impact. Again, to emphasize, the parties have not contacted the PCC about this deal. We do not have a copy of the investment agreement, and we are basing what we are initially presenting before the Commission on publicly available data and the information that we have told as part of our initial assessment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair,
Thank you very much,
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Bernabe. So now we proceed. That's the third resource person. No? So we now can proceed to the interpellation. Meron na po lima nagparista. The Honorable Marcoleta, then followed by the Honorable Lagman, then followed by the Honorable Teves, then the Honorable Vice Chair Parsaga, and the Honorable Anthony Godes. Kung meron po magpaparista, please inform the Secretariat. The Chair recognizes the Honorable Rodante Marcoleta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question to the Commissioner of the PCC. He mentioned the two kinds of tests. One is the notification test. While he mentioned Section 17, I think he failed to explain to us that parties to the merger or acquisition agreement referred to wherein the value of the transaction exceeds 1 billion pesos are subject to notification. It is already, as mentioned by him, in Section 17. And based on publicly available information, I think the value of the acquired outstanding stock of TV5, Mr. Chair, is over 2 billion pesos. Is this not a basis of notification, Mr. Commissioner, considering that the threshold value here is only 1 billion pesos?
May I answer, Mr. Chair?
You may answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable Marcoleta, there is a provision in the Bayanihan Act which increased for 2 years, for a 2-year period, the value of transactions that may be reviewed by the PCC to 50 billion pesos. That will expire on September 15, if I'm not mistaken. But for now, we cannot review any transaction which falls below a value of 50 billion pesos. And this is because the House of Representatives and the Senate passed that law in 2020.
I know that, Mr. Chair, but considering Section 17, when it mentions a threshold amount of 1 billion pesos, where agreements can be prohibited if it exceeds 1 billion pesos, I suppose, why did you not look into that, considering that the publicly available information already suggested that the acquisition of substantial shares of TV5 exceeded more than 2 billion pesos? This is the point here, because Section 17 is about compulsory notification. That is only my point. If you can explain that, because it talks about 1 billion pesos only.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please proceed. You
Yes. The Bayanihan 2 Act precisely modifies or suspends the operation of that threshold provided in Section 17, Your Honor. So if we proceed to review this transaction, or if we compel ABS-CBN and TV5 to notify us, we would be in violation of Bayanihan 2. But just to clarify, Mr. Chair, even if this transaction is not notifiable, we can initiate on our own a motu proprio review of the transaction, but we have to have a reasonable basis. And that reasonable basis will be something that we will discuss and deliberate upon when our Mergers and Acquisitions Office comes back to the Commission and Bank with the report and recommendation by the first or second week of September.
Mr. Chair, the reasonable basis that the good commissioner is talking about is the definition of control itself, which appears under Section 4 of the PCC Charter. And it was also exemplified also under Section 25 on control of an equity, where control also exists even when entity owns 1/2 or less of the voting power of another entity, when there are 3 conditions here, Mr. Commissioner. And the last one, I will emphasize that, letter F, when there exist rights or contracts which confer decisive influence on the decisions of the entity. This is where you should come in. Because if that control, even if by way of stocks it's even lesser or acquisitions even lesser, but it is not the question of value only that manifest control, Mr. Chair and Mr. Commissioner, because this particular provision of your charter elicits conditions where control can come in. You made mention about vertical merger earlier, which is a condition between companies that are along the same supply chain, and this is correct. But maybe you should also consider that these 2 merging companies or companies that are now trying to be in partnership, they're also exercising horizontal merger, Mr. Chair, because horizontal merger is a condition between companies that directly compete with each other. So you will see, Mr. Commissioner, it's not only vertical situation that is involved here. It is horizontal merger as well, because of the control that ABS-CBN might play here. Can you imagine? ABS-CBN will be the one supplying the contents already, and TV5 will not do that anymore. And so it is like, giving away your right to produce contents, and it is only ABS-CBN who is going to do that. In other words, when ABS-CBN lost its franchise to do that, to produce contents, we are now giving it another vehicle to do just that. So there are so many aspects that we should review here. And competition-wise, Mr. Commissioner, it is of course your bounden duty to look into the consumer welfare.
Bato.
It is very obvious that the dominance of ABS-CBN in contents will again be a forceful factor here that you should also consider.
Hindi, yung
And your mandate
Bato,
is
yung
very
back-to-back.
clear that any anti-competitive agreement should be looked
yung
into,
bids, di ba,
and
bids?
even the abuse of dominant position should be looked into if the object or the effect of which might lessen or even prevent competition. Ito yung dapat nating tingnan, not only on the issue of notification. Maybe they have their ways to evade that and circumvent that, but the ultimate analysis will be on whether or not the combination between these two networks will stifle competition and it will not inure to the benefit of the greater consumers. Mr. Chair, Mr. Commissioner, thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I offer a quick reaction to the Honorable Congressman?
Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Congressman Marcoleta, for your very
Kalahati lang naman ang kinuha ba, no?
insights. I would limit myself to two issues you have
Back to
raised.
back yun.
The first one is on the matter of control and whether that is sufficient to vest in us jurisdiction. I think the question of control is what we look at for purposes of considering this transaction an acquisition.
Kasi hindi nakikita, natatakpan.
It is not a merger from our perspective, but it is an acquisition because there is a purchase of shares. You know, whether or not it reaches the 35% threshold or not, it is an acquisition of shares. The 35% threshold only relates to the question of whether it should be notified. And as you noticed, ABS-CBN only pegged its purchase of shares at up to 34.99%, below the 35%. Now, whatever the reason is, that is beyond what we would wish to comment on at this point. But definitely, the reference to the matter of vestiges or badges of control, to our mind, qualifies the transaction as an acquisition. Now, the second thing is the fact that it is an acquisition, does it already form a reasonable basis for us to initiate a motu proprio review? If I may clarify, the basis for conducting a motu proprio review will have to also include an initial assessment of whether the transaction is likely to cause a substantial lessening of
Try
competition
tayo ng isa
based on a very cursory
Mag-try nga tayo.
examination of the facts. And that is something that we are in the process of doing. And the determination of a substantial lessening of competition is an economic analysis at the end of the day. But we are expediting it so that we can have a recommendation on whether or not to open a motu proprio review of the transaction if the parties do not choose to voluntarily notify the same. On the second issue with regard to vertical effects and horizontal mergers, you're absolutely right, Congressman Marcoleta. We are going to look at both. We are going to look at the markets where ABS-CBN and TV5 are competitors. And I enumerated in part what those are. You are also correct that we are going to look at the vertical effects of the merger, the fact that they are in a supply chain relationship, one developing content and the other one using that content for purposes of broadcasting. Now, I mentioned earlier that the parallel transaction of Signal acquiring Sky also adds further complications. And we will be looking at what we call as the conglomerate effects of this acquisition. Conglomerate because these are conglomerates. And that is a unique feature of the Philippine economy, that many of our entities are part of conglomerates. And we will be looking at that as well if we conduct a review. So rest assured, Your Honor, that we will be looking at all of these matters very carefully, including what may result out of the transaction as a possible dominance of ABS-CBN in terms of content development and how it may be relating to a foreclosure of other markets for its airing or for the sourcing of content by TV5 itself. So we will be looking at these matters, Your Honor.
You may look into also market extension merger, Mr. Commissioner, and product extension merger. Thank you.
We will do so, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Okay.
just
So
a
now-
clarification.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes, no, Vice Chair Barsaga.
well, I was present even at the time we started the hearing. And I just remember, I'm not sure whether or not our source persons have taken their oath. So I would like to verify whether or not the source persons have already taken their oath before our committee.
Shown to that they have not taken their oath. Is there?
I'm
Do you wish that?
Source persons be required to take their oath.
Okay, on the motion of the Honorable Vice Chair Barsaga, may I direct the
Bakit
COMSEC
niludan ko
to
si Bet
please
ng ano?
administer the
Sabi
oath to our
mo,
resource persons.
yung ano ba yun, yung 100, i-trade this lang na ubos
Yes,
na.
Mr.
Sabi
Chairman,
ko, ano
may I
daw,
ask the resource persons
video siguro
from
siya.
the committee,
Kahit sa ano,
from the
kahit sa-
Philippine
sa-
Competition
sa
Commission,
Globe?
the Securities and
Ganun pa rin.
Exchange Commission,
Ano ba, Global?
Commission, and
Smart.
from the
Siya smart.
NTC,
Kasi
to
ang,
please raise your
ano,
right hand.
May limit din kasi yan dito eh.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the
panood mo
truth
sa
before this joint
mga
congressional
YouTube,
inquiry, so help you God?
ubos agad
I
yan.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, COMSEC. So are we done, Honorable Marcoleta? Tapos na po kayo, so we can move to the next interpreter. The Honorable Marcoleta.
Yan na, may na.
So I don't think he's online. So now we can proceed, no?
Mr. Chair, pagbigyan ko si Congressman Barsaga, siya na muna.
Okay, ang susunod na kalista si The Honorable Lagman, listahan. So,
Okay.
The Honorable Edset Lagman is second.
Okay.
The Honorable Lagman.
Ano yung ginawa ko? Nanalo pa rin yun sila.
Honorable Lagman, you have the floor.
Nanalo pa rin yan.
Thank you,
Tumanda na rin tayo.
Joint Chairman. Before I start with my interpellation, may I be allowed to read into the records a letter to Speaker Romualdez dated
Panalo pa rin
22
yan.
August 2022, which would really set the tone and preliminarily join the issues for purposes of this inquiry. May I proceed, Mr. Chairman?
Ano nangyari doon sa ano?
Please proceed. You have 20 minutes for your
Si
interpretation.
Yuki ba ang ano kasama
Including
mo,
the joint
sinasabi mo di?
Honorable Martin
Ano, bakit din yung kinausap namin mo?
Speaker, House of
Tangi,
Representatives,
pasapin yung dalawa ni
Batasan
Yuki.
Complex, Quezon
Kahit
City.
na dalawa ni Yuki magkumbinsi.
Speaker Romualdez,
Kaya parang sila
I write on behalf of my constituents and concerned
Pala
citizens